It begins not with a scream, but with a cigarette offered across a polished oak table. You are standing in a room that does not officially exist, inside a country estate turned inside out by the requirements of a war that has swallowed the globe. Outside, the Virginia woods are silent, a wet blanket of autumn leaves muffling any sound of the real world. Inside, a German field marshal, a man who commanded armies of hundreds of thousands, is laughing at a joke told by his American interrogator. He does not realize that the laughter is the most devastating weapon in the room. He does not know that the floral arrangement on the sideboard conceals a microphone. He has no idea that every syllable he utters about his wife, his regrets, and his technical knowledge of a jet engine that could turn the tide of the war is being vacuumed up by intelligence officers in the basement, transcribed, and handed to a man with a map of the Peony-mooned rocket complex within the hour. This is the story of a secret installation so classified that it was known only as a postal code, P.O. Box 1142. It was a place where the United States, faced with the monolithic, fanatical machinery of the Third Reich, tossed away the medieval rulebook of hot irons and thumbscrews and replaced it with a weapon of chilling sophistication, intellectual seduction. This is the narrative of how a group of mostly Jewish refugees, men who had fled the very regime they were now dismantling, systematically broke the will and the silence of Hitler's most decorated paladins without leaving a single physical mark. The scalpels were empathy, boredom, and the arrogant, irrepressible need of a Prussian general to prove that he was the smartest man in the room. Welcome to the interrogation camp that won the intelligence war not by breaking bones, but by breaking minds through the simple, deadly act of conversation. To understand the surgical precision of P.O. Box 1142, you must first erase the cinematic image of the wartime interrogation. There were no blinding lights swinging from a damp ceiling, no physical brutality as defined by the Geneva Convention's brutal calculus. The United States, by 1942, had a catastrophic problem that raw violence could not solve. The Allies were drowning in tactical data, but starving for strategic intelligence. They knew the caliber of a Panzer shell and the range of an 88 flak gun, but they remained blind to the Third Reich's technological acceleration, the atomic whispers, the aerodynamic revolution of the jet turbine, and the ballistic arc of the vengeance weapons that were just beginning their migration from blueprint to launch pad. The traditional method of interrogating high-value prisoners was failing. A Prussian officer corps, bred on a centuries-old code of silence and a profound, sneering contempt for the supposed mongrel democracy of the West, clammed up the moment they were captured. They gave name, rank, and serial number, and then they gave nothing but a marble stare. The U.S. War Department, through the Military Intelligence Service, understood a terrifying truth. The bottleneck of victory was not steel production or oil reserves. It was the space between the ears of a German general. The solution required a paradigm shift that bordered on the heretical in a time of industrial slaughter. They had to build a luxury prison, a staging ground for psychological theater, so convincing that the prisoners would forget they were prisoners. The location chosen was Fort Hunt, Virginia, a defunct coastal fortification just a few miles down the Potomac River from the nerve center of the nation's capital. It was perfectly placed. It was isolated by dense hardwood forests, yet close enough to the Pentagon for couriers to deliver verbatim transcripts within the hour. Officially, the camp did not exist. Its mail was routed through a dead drop system in Washington, D.C., addressed only to the cryptic cipher, P.O. Box 1142. The men selected to run this shadow factory were the ultimate asymmetric weapon. They were not grizzled counterintelligence cowboys. They were the intellectual cream of a shattered continent. The core of the interrogation teams consisted of the Ritchie Boys, a group of soldiers trained at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, who possessed the most lethal qualification imaginable. They were native German speakers. A vast number of them were Jewish refugees who had escaped the maw of the Holocaust. They had walked the streets of Berlin, studied at Heidelberg, and memorized the poems of Goethe before their lives were destroyed by the very regime they now faced. To place a Jewish refugee from Munich across the table from a monocled Wehrmacht general was to detonate a psychological depth charge in the first second of contact. The German command structure operated on a mythology of racial hierarchy. The presence of these superior, erudite, and utterly composed American officers shattered the Nazi cosmology before a single question was asked. The blueprint was not to interrogate a captive. It was to dismantle a worldview. The physical architecture of the camp was a lie. The holding areas were painted in soothing pastels. The rooms had natural light. There was a tennis court. There was a library. The food was not the slop of a prison camp, but the measured haute cuisine of a mid-tier European hotel, calibrated precisely to lower cortisol levels and resurrect the habits of civilized discourse. Every inch of the physical environment was a denial of the narrative the German high command had been fed by their propaganda ministry. They had been promised savagery and torture, a vindication of their belief that Americans were soft barbarians. Instead, they found a mirror of their own lost culture. This cognitive dissonance was the first crack in the dam. A man who expects a beating and receives a handshake is neurologically destabilized. His threat assessment programming crashes, and into the vacuum steps the interrogator. The initial intake was a masterclass in psychological jiu-jitsu. A freshly captured corps commander, still wearing the dust of the Tunisian desert or the mud of the Norman hedgerows, would be flown in a blacked-out aircraft to Washington, bundled into a sedan with tinted windows, and driven through the anonymous gates of Fort Hunt. He expected a basement cell. Instead, he was greeted by an American officer in a perfectly pressed uniform, clicking his heels lightly and speaking in unaccented High German. "Herr General, your quarters are ready. I regret the inconvenience of your journey. Perhaps you would care to freshen up before we have lunch." The greeting was a customized virus. The use of the honorific Herr General, strictly forbidden by standard operational protocol but weaponized here, stroked the Prussian ego's desperate need for recognition. The interrogator was not just a translator. He was a historian of the German military soul. He knew that a lieutenant general from a noble Saxon family would respond to different code words than a newly promoted corps commander who had clawed his way up from the working class. The first day of interrogation was never about extracting a tank position. It was about extracting a psychological profile. The American operatives would map the general's vanity, his professional jealousy, his resentment toward the Waffen-SS, his secret dread that the war was lost, and his burning, unquenchable desire to justify his strategic decisions to a sympathetic ear. The operational tempo inside P.O. Box 1142 was a grinding, invisible war of patience. The casual lunch would extend into a walk around the meticulously maintained grounds. A leaf might fall, and the interrogator would pivot, quoting a line of Rilke about autumn, watching for the micro-flash of shock in the general's eyes. The trap was set with the bait of nostalgia. For an officer who had been fighting a brutal, dehumanizing war of attrition on the Eastern Front, the sudden immersion into a bubble of intellectual Weimar culture was intoxicating. They began to talk, not about troop movements, but about music, philosophy, and the tragedy of Germany's path. The American listener was a sponge. Every mention of a town, a laboratory, or a colleague's nickname was logged and cross-referenced. The hidden architecture of the camp turned the entire living space into a confessional. The prisoners were placed in shared suites, often with other high-ranking officers from rival branches of the service. A Luftwaffe ace might be bunked with an infantry general who had been promised air cover that never arrived. A proud panzer commander might be forced to share a bathroom with an SS bureaucrat he blamed for the savage partisan reprisals that had made his supply lines a living hell. The Americans bugged everything. The light fixtures, the picture frames, the leg of the grand piano. Down in the basement, known only to the operators as the dungeon, Rows of scribes and wire recorders captured every single sound wave that traveled through the ceiling. This was the true interrogation, the unguarded conversation between the prisoners when the polite American officer had gone home for the night. "The Americans are fools," one general might scoff. "They still believe we are producing tanks at the Essen rate. The real secret is the dispersal of the assembly line into the Harz tunnels." In that single, arrogant whisper, a strategic bombing campaign was redirected. The interrogators used a technique we now recognize as the cultivation of emotional dependency. The highest value prisoners were assigned a primary interrogator who functioned as a handler, a confessor, and a friend. This was a slow, corrosive process. The German general, isolated from his command, his fatherland in flames, and his honor code rendered obsolete by the brutality of the Nazi regime, was a man hollowed out by existential despair. The interrogator filled that hollow. He brought books. He arranged for special dietary requests. He listened for 6 hours without interruption to the general's detailed defense of the operational retreat at Sicily. He did not call it a retreat. He called it a masterful disengagement. The German officers, starved of respect by a political leadership that had repeatedly scapegoated the general staff for Hitler's strategic blunders, found themselves basking in the validation of their enemies. The psychological phenomenon is known as the Stockholm Syndrome in its most profound intellectual form. They began to leak, not to betray the Reich, they told themselves, but to educate these well-meaning Americans on the art of war. One of the most devastatingly effective operators in this velvet-gloved machine was a man whose family had been obliterated in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. He sat across from a Luftwaffe major general who had overseen the technical development of the V-1 flying bomb program. The American did not rage. He did not even mention the war crimes. He calmly laid out blueprints, treating the German officer as a peer engineer. "The resonance on the pulse jet intake seems inefficient," the interrogator remarked, his voice flat, his eyes unblinking. "Surely at the Peenemünde testing range, you observed a harmonic failure at high throttle." The major general froze. The question was so technically specific, so surgically precise, that it implied the Americans already possessed the complete technical file. In reality, the interrogator was bluffing with scraps of aerial reconnaissance and an intuitive grasp of aerodynamics. But the German officer, his vanity pricked, could not bear to let a technical falsehood stand. "No, you misunderstand the fuel-air mixture cycle entirely," he snapped back, and then, unable to stop the motor of his own expertise, he began to lecture. For the next 3 hours, he drew diagrams of launch ramps, aiming mechanisms, and the logistical pipeline of the V-2 ballistic missile, a weapon so secret that only a handful of men in the world fully understood its gyroscopic guidance system. The interrogator listened, nodded, and refilled the general's coffee cup. The information was on the desk of General Eisenhower before the German had finished his dessert that evening. The operational reality was that the camp weaponized the toxic internal politics of the Nazi state. The Third Reich was a Darwinian labyrinth of overlapping jurisdictions and personal hatreds. The Abwehr despised the Sicherheitsdienst. The Wehrmacht officer corps, with its aristocratic roots, deeply mistrusted the populist, radical Nazi party loyalists who had infiltrated the SS command chain. The American handlers turned this fault line into a canyon. They would let slip a fabricated rumor, planted by a hidden speaker or a double agent in the kitchen staff, that a certain SS general had been boasting of the cowardice of the army group. The Prussian general, upon hearing this slander, would explode with volcanic rage. In his desperate, self-righteous attempt to restore the honor of his branch, he would spill tactical details as a form of moral justification. "You want to know why we lost at Kursk?" he would roar. It was not the failure of the Panzer Corps. It was the catastrophic intelligence leak from the Führer's headquarters. In proving his professional competence, he was demolishing the last defenses of the war effort he had sworn to protect. The Americans, silent and sympathetic, simply opened the pressure valve and let the secrets pour out. The breaking of a German general was rarely a single, dramatic explosion of tears. It was a quiet, methodical erosion of the will, a collapse that occurred in the gray, rain-soaked hours between midnight and dawn, when a man is left alone with the microphones. The turning points within P.O. Box 1142 often hinged on a calculated act of humanity that was more devastating than any threat. This was the ultimate refinement of the non-torture doctrine, the strategic deployment of kindness as a demolition charge. Consider the case of a captured Panzer Corps commander who had been instrumental in the brutal Russian campaign. He was a fortress of silence, conditioned by a rigid Prussian military code that equated interrogation survival with passive resistance. He refused to speak. He refused the food. He stared at the wall with the unblinking 1,000-yard stare of a man who had commanded burning Tiger tanks. The interrogator assigned to him did not push. He did not threaten court-martial or execution. Instead, he entered the room one afternoon carrying a heavy, leather-bound box. Without a word, he placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a complete, hand-painted collection of medieval knights, meticulously crafted lead figures that the general, as a boy, had collected in his aristocratic home in Saxony. The American had contacted the general's family through the clandestine network of the Red Cross and the OSS. The gesture was a silent announcement. "We know your innocence. We know the boy you were before the uniform consumed you." The general's hands trembled. His rigid posture dissolved. The core of his identity, the brutal, stoic warrior, was bypassed by a direct strike at his humanity. He began to sob. Within 48 hours, he was debriefing on the structural weaknesses of the Panther tank's frontal armor, information that saved countless Allied lives when the Western Front erupted. The leverage was not pain. The leverage was the memory of a childhood that the war had stolen. The most explosive intelligence coups of the camp occurred during the phases of what the interrogators called post-professional catharsis. Once a high-value prisoner had fully bonded with his handler and accepted the de facto role of a retired military advisor, the flow of secrets became a flood. The German generals, many of them deeply embedded in the industrial military complex of the Reich, possessed systemic knowledge that no single spy could ever steal. They knew the location of the synthetic oil refineries hidden in the Bohemian forests. They knew the electromagnetic frequency of the new proximity fuses. But more critically, they held the psychological key to the Nazi high command's decision loop. They knew that Hitler was micromanaging the jet fighter program, demanding the Me-262 be refitted as a fast bomber rather than a defensive interceptor. This operational schizophrenia, revealed in a quiet chat over a chessboard, allowed the Allied air forces to develop a strategy that intentionally provoked the Führer's tactical insanity. By bombing civilian targets, they knew Hitler would order retaliatory vengeance rather than coherent defense, thereby guaranteeing the Luftwaffe's futile offensive dispersal. One of the most remarkable psychological shifts occurred with the capture of scientists and general officers associated with the advanced weaponry programs. A senior administrative general from the Army Ordnance Office arrived at Fort Hunt believing he was the custodian of the future. He was arrogant, technically brilliant, and utterly dismissive of the Americans' scientific capacity. The interrogation team changed tactics. They did not appeal to his loyalty to his nation, which was crumbling, nor to his fear of punishment, which he did not believe he merited. They appealed to his professional ego's terror of oblivion. They presented him with a proposition disguised as a symposium. The war is lost for the Third Reich, Herr General. That is a mathematical certainty. The question we put to you is not about loyalty. It is about legacy. Do you wish the 10,000 pages of your rocket telemetry research to be burned in a final artillery shell, lost to mankind forever? Or do you wish to ensure that your life's work, your genius, is recognized as the foundation of the future age of propulsion? Speak to us, and your name goes into the engineering textbooks. Remain silent, and you are just the anonymous man who lost. The choice was a devil's bargain steeped in intellectual vanity. The general looked into the void of historical irrelevance and blinked. He opened his briefcase. He began to outline the precise fuel injection specs of the V2 engine, the alloy composition of the turbine blades that were just beginning to crack under heat stress, and most terrifyingly, the early theoretical designs for a transatlantic ballistic missile that had crossed his desk from the Peenemünde dark think tanks. The Americans exchanged no triumphant glances. They simply poured the whiskey and kept the conversation flowing. The intelligence bonanza that hit the desk of the War Department over the following weeks would directly shape Operation Paperclip and the frantic post-war scramble for Nazi scientific brainpower. The most subtle psychological manipulation was the total inversion of the interrogation power dynamic through feigned ignorance. The interrogators, many of them possessing university degrees in physics and engineering, would intentionally miscast a technical detail. Of course, the American might say, tapping a map of the French coast, the Atlantic wall's strength relies entirely on the depth of the steel-reinforced concrete. The German engineering officer, a pedant to his core, would physically recoil. "You completely misunderstand the static defense principle," he would scold. "It is not the vertical depth, it is the interlocking fields of fire and the pre-registered mortar grids beneath the beach obstacles. Here, let me show you exactly how we position the Panzerturm bunkers to enfilade Omaha Beach." He would grab the pencil, unable to tolerate the intellectual error of his captor, and in correcting it, he would provide the precise operational grid of the deadliest landing zone in American history. The intelligence on Omaha Beach that came out of P.O. Box 1142 was so granular that it was suppressed from field commanders to prevent paralysis by analysis, yet it armed the planners with the exact density of resistance they would face. The American interrogator, playing the fool, had used the general's own intellectual arrogance as a self-extracting data scoop. The turning point for the entire camp's strategic value came when fragments of intercepted conversations revealed a grim, unifying secret that even many high-ranking officers had not acknowledged openly: the systematic, industrial nature of the Holocaust. In the early days, the German prisoners maintained a charade of ignorance. "It was a shame," they would murmur, "that the SS took care of certain administrative matters in the East." The interrogators, many of them bearing the psychic scars of the genocide in their own family histories, used a technique of controlled silence. They would place an SS officer and a Wehrmacht general in a bugged sitting room and wait. The SS man, utterly indoctrinated, would boast of the logistical miracle of the final solution. The general, horrified not by the morality but by the tactical stupidity of using rail stock for death camps instead of troop movements, would argue back. In that vicious, self-incriminating argument, the true scale of the abattoir emerged. The names of the camps, the efficiency of the Zyklon B pellets, the number of trains per week. The intelligence community had long suspected the horror, but the verbatim transcript from a Nazi general's own lips, taped in a Virginia sitting room, was the ultimate, undeniable testament. This information, though operational only in a moral sense, hardened the resolve of the Allied command and cemented the stark reality that this was a war of extinction that could only be met with unconditional surrender. The camp had broken not just tactical secrets, it had broken the psychological wall of denial that the German High Command had built around its own monstrous soul. The output of P.O. Box 1142 was a deluge of actionable intelligence that rippled through every theater of the war. By the closing year of the conflict, the camp had processed over 3,400 high-value prisoners, and its debriefing reports filled entire libraries within the Pentagon. The fingerprints of Fort Hunt are invisible on the major battles of the late war, but they are present on every map. The interrogation of Luftwaffe officers revealed that the German jet fighter, the Me-262, was critically dependent on a rare alloy mined in a single vulnerable facility, leading to a targeted bombing raid that crippled the jet program before it could reach critical mass. The gossip of a demoralized logistics general exposed the train schedules of the synthetic fuel convoys, allowing the Allied air forces to achieve the complete paralysis of the German mobile divisions during the Battle of the Bulge. The tanks ran dry not merely because of a lack of fuel, but because a talkative prisoner in Virginia had sketched the exact choke point of the hydrogenation plants. The technological harvest was staggering. The German prisoners, particularly the scientists who began to see the Americans as their only escape from Soviet captivity, handed over the blueprints for the proximity fuse, the aerodynamic secrets of the swept wing, and the physiological limits of the human body under high-G acceleration, data that became the bedrock of the American space program. This was intelligence warfare at a molecular level. The camp was not just breaking German generals, it was reverse engineering the entire German technological leap. The interrogators would bring in a disassembled part from a crashed V-2 rocket and simply place it on the table. The German scientist, having been softened by weeks of deferential treatment and excellent wine, would instinctively begin to fidget with the gyro, muttering about the instability of the carbon veins, and in doing so, would solve the technical puzzle for his captors without a single formal question being asked. Perhaps the most profound strategic impact of P.O. Box 1142 was its psychological demobilization of the Wehrmacht's strategic leadership. The camp operated a repatriation review board that assessed prisoners for release or continued detention. But the real purpose was to send broken, empathetic, and Western-leaning officers back into the prisoner pipeline, where they would poison the morale of the stalwart resistors. A general who had been treated with chivalry and kindness would write letters to his subordinates, extolling the honor of the American officer corps and the futility of further resistance. This soft power warfare corroded the enemy command structure far more effectively than execution threats. The camp had weaponized the concept of honor against a regime that had none, and in doing so, it had preserved the lives of thousands of American soldiers who would have faced fanatical last stands. The gates of P.O. Box 1142 swung shut in 1946. The wire recorders were dismantled. The transcripts were stamped with the highest level of classification and buried in the archives of the National Security Agency, where they would remain hidden for over 60 years. The men who had run the camp, the Ritchie Boys and the intelligence savants, melted back into civilian life. They became lawyers, professors, and diplomats, their wartime service a secret they carried silently to their graves. The German generals were eventually repatriated, never fully understanding the depth of the psychological penetration they had undergone. Many of them published sanitized memoirs in the post-war years, portraying themselves as stoic professionals who had resisted interrogation. They died never knowing that the polite American who played chess with them had been a Jewish refugee whose entire family had been murdered by the regime they served, and that in every game they lost, they had inadvertently surrendered a piece of the Nazi war machine. The legacy of this secret camp is a profound and haunting challenge to our understanding of power and intelligence. It established the modern interrogation doctrine that views the subject's psychological needs, ego, respect, intellectual acknowledgement, as vulnerabilities far deeper than the body's capacity to withstand pain. The camp proved that the most effective interrogation room does not look like a dungeon. It looks like a drawing room, and the most devastating interrogator does not carry a whip but a book of poetry. It stands as a historical anomaly, a moment where civilization, even in the heart of total war, discovered that the truth serum of the human soul is not a chemical compound, but the basic, unquenchable need to be understood. As the last leaves fall over the forgotten concrete foundations at Fort Hunt, a tactical question lingers in the humid Virginia air, a question that is more relevant now than it was in 1944. In an era of black sites, enhanced interrogation, and the endless debate over the utility of force, the ghosts of P.O. Box 1142 ask us a simple question. If a room without fear can shatter a fanatical general, What does that reveal about the fragility of ideology itself? The answer is buried in the silence of the woods, waiting for those who understand that the most destructive weapon in the arsenal of democracy was never a bomb. It was a conversation. The camp broke the men who thought they were unbreakable, and it did so by granting them the one thing their own government had always denied them: the dignity of a listening ear. That is the paradox of the secret war, and it remains the most classified, most misunderstood, and most terrifyingly effective operation in the history of human conflict.